I am Ibrahim Traoré, but today I do not want you to look at me as a president. I want you to look at me as a brother from Africa, a man who once walked barefoot on dry ground, a man who grew up watching mothers hide their tears because there was not enough food for the children, a man who knows what it means to stare at the future and feel fear instead of hope. Tonight, I am speaking to cameras that will travel across the world. Maybe people in Washington will hear these words. Maybe people in Paris, London, or New York will hear them too. But my message is not truly for the powerful people sitting inside beautiful buildings. My message is for the forgotten. It is for the young African boy sitting in darkness because electricity has failed again. It is for the teenager digging gold from the earth instead of sitting in a classroom. It is for the young girl who grew up hearing gunfire outside her window but still dares to dream of becoming someone important. And it is also for every older man and woman listening to me now. Because many of you have lived long enough to watch generations rise and collapse. You have seen promises broken. You have seen leaders come and go. You have seen countries rich in resources remain poor in dignity. So before I continue, I ask you for one thing. Do not listen to me as a politician. Listen to me as a witness. Because there are things I have seen that changed my life forever. There are things I can no longer keep silent about. For many years, the world has spoken about Africa as if Africa is a wounded child that can never stand alone. They speak about our poverty. They speak about our wars. They speak about corruption. And yes, those things are real. I have seen them with my own eyes. I have walked through villages where children drink dirty water. I have stood beside families who lost everything to violence. I have met young men who believed death was closer to them than opportunity. But there is something the world never speaks about honestly. They never ask why a continent so rich became so broken. They never ask why countries filled with gold, oil, diamonds, uranium, and fertile land still struggle to feed their people. Instead, they point at Africa and say, these people cannot govern themselves. What they do not say is how deeply Africa has been manipulated. For generations, outsiders entered our lands pretending to help while quietly taking everything valuable. When they could not control us with weapons, they controlled us with money. When money was not enough, they used fear. When fear was not enough, they used division. And the saddest part is this. After hearing these lies for so many years, many young Africans began believing them. Some now believe their skin is a curse. Some believe intelligence only belongs to others. Some believe success can only exist outside Africa. That is the greatest tragedy. Not poverty, not war, but the destruction of belief. Because once a young person loses belief in themselves, they become easy to control. I have seen young Africans risk their lives crossing deserts and oceans because they believe there is no future at home. I have seen brilliant minds abandon their countries because they were taught to admire everyone except themselves. I have seen social media slowly poison the minds of young people until they measure their worth through money, luxury, and imitation. And every time another young African falls into hopelessness, there are people somewhere benefiting from it. People who profit when Africa remains weak. People who smile when Africans fight each other. People who grow rich while our people remain dependent. But despite all of this, I refuse to believe Africa is doomed. Because I have also seen another side of my continent. I have seen children studying under trees with more determination than students inside wealthy schools. I have seen mothers sacrifice food so their children can continue learning. I have seen young men willing to give their lives not for power but for dignity. I have seen courage where the world expected surrender. That is why I still have hope. Not because Africa is free from problems, but because I know the spirit of our people is still alive. And perhaps that is why what happened to me changed everything. There was a night I could no longer carry the weight inside my heart. I had spent days traveling, listening to people, hearing stories of suffering that stayed inside my mind long after the conversations ended. I remember returning to my room exhausted. The silence around me felt heavy. I asked myself a question that frightened me. Does Africa truly still have a future? I sat alone for a long time that night. No cameras, no advisors, no speeches, just silence. And eventually, without realizing it, I fell asleep. What happened next is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. And it is the reason I am speaking to you now. That night, sleep did not feel like ordinary sleep. It felt as though my spirit had been pulled away from the world I knew. At first, there was only darkness. Not the peaceful darkness of night. It was a heavy darkness, a darkness that felt alive. Then slowly, I opened my eyes. I was standing in a place I did not recognize, yet somehow it felt painfully familiar. The air was hot. The ground beneath my feet was dry and cracked. Dust moved through the wind like smoke after destruction. The sky above me looked wounded. There was no brightness in it, no warmth, no sense of life, only a strange silence that made my heart uneasy. I began walking forward, and with every step, I realized I was looking at Africa, but not the Africa I knew. This was Africa in the future, a future that felt broken beyond words. I saw children walking barefoot across burning earth. Their bodies were thin, their eyes looked empty. Some searched through piles of garbage for food. Others sat beside dead rivers where water once flowed. I wanted to speak to them. I wanted to help them, but it felt as though they could not hear me. As I continued walking, I saw young men standing in crowded streets with nothing to do. No jobs, no schools, no hope. Their faces carried anger mixed with despair. Some held weapons. Others carried drugs. Many looked as though they had already stopped believing life could become better. I saw gangs controlling neighborhoods where governments no longer had power. I saw corruption everywhere. Men in expensive suits lived behind guarded walls while ordinary people starved outside. And what hurt me most was this. The land itself was still rich. I could see trucks carrying gold. I could see foreign companies removing minerals from the earth. I could see wealth leaving Africa every single day. But the people remained poor. The deeper I walked into that vision, the more pain I felt inside my chest. I saw schools abandoned and falling apart, books covered in dust, children who wanted education but had nowhere to learn. I saw hospitals without medicine. I saw mothers crying beside sick children they could not save. I saw entire villages controlled by fear. And everywhere I looked, I saw young people losing themselves. Some drowned their pain in violence. Some escaped into addiction. Some no longer cared whether they lived or died. I remember hearing voices around me, not clear voices, whispers, thousands of whispers, and they all carried the same message. There is no future. There is no hope. You were born to suffer. Those words felt more dangerous than bullets. Because once a generation accepts hopelessness, destruction becomes easy. I kept walking through this nightmare, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then suddenly, I noticed something that froze me completely. I saw African people fighting each other while outsiders watched from a distance. Tribes against tribes. Nations against nations, brothers against brothers, and above all of it, there were powerful people growing rich from the chaos. I saw leaders selling their countries piece by piece. Some traded dignity for money, others traded truth for power, and ordinary people paid the price. At one point, I stood in front of a group of young boys carrying rifles larger than their own bodies. Their faces looked tired, too young to understand war, too young to understand death. One of them looked directly at me, and I will never forget his eyes. There was no childhood left inside them, only survival. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask the world how this could happen. How could a continent with so much beauty become trapped in so much suffering? How could the children of Africa inherit so much pain? Then something even more frightening happened. I saw young Africans slowly forgetting who they were. I saw them ashamed of their own skin, ashamed of their languages, ashamed of their traditions, ashamed of their history. They copied everything from outside because they no longer believed anything valuable could come from within themselves. And I understood something terrible. The destruction of Africa was not only happening through war or poverty, it was happening through the destruction of identity. Because once people forget their worth, they become easy to manipulate. I saw young people chasing empty dreams while abandoning their communities. I saw social media turning attention into addiction. I saw corruption becoming normal. I saw dishonesty celebrated. I saw people mocking discipline and praising selfishness. And every time another young person lost direction, the darkness around Africa seemed to grow stronger. The vision became heavier. The heat became unbearable. The cries of suffering surrounded me from every direction. I fell to my knees. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt afraid. Not for myself, but for the future. I remember whispering one question: can this future still be changed? And then something happened. A light appeared in the distance. At first it was small, but slowly it grew brighter. The darkness around me began pulling away from it. The air changed. The fear inside me became still. And as the light moved closer, I realized I was no longer alone. The light moved toward me slowly. Not like lightning, not like fire. It was calm, pure. The kind of light that makes fear lose its power. I stood there unable to move. The dust in the air seemed to disappear around it. The noise of suffering became quiet, and then I saw him. Jesus. I know there will be people listening to me who may question these words. Some may believe, others may doubt, but I can only tell you what I experienced. And what I saw that night felt more real than the world I had left behind. He walked toward me without anger, without judgment. There was sadness in his eyes, but also peace. A peace so powerful it made the chaos around us feel small. I could not speak at first. I felt the weight of everything I had witnessed pressing against my soul. The starving children, the violence, the hopelessness, the broken future of Africa standing before me like a warning. And then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but every word carried strength. He said, "This is the future waiting for Africa if humanity refuses to change." Those words struck me deeply, because until that moment, I believed many of our problems came only from politics, economics, or foreign interference. But he showed me something deeper. He showed me that nations collapse long before buildings fall. They collapse when truth disappears, when greed becomes normal, when young people stop believing life has meaning. I asked him why this future had become so dark, and he answered with painful honesty. He said the first reason was corruption, not only corruption of money, but corruption of the soul. He showed me leaders who once promised to serve their people but later became servants of power, men who sold the dignity of their nations for personal wealth, men who shook hands with outsiders while their own people suffered. He showed me leaders building luxury while villages collapsed, leaders speaking about patriotism while secretly feeding systems that kept Africa weak. Then Jesus looked at me and said something I still carry inside my heart every day. He said, "A leader who loves power more than people becomes a weapon against his own nation." I felt shame hearing those words, not only for Africa, but for humanity, because corruption exists everywhere. Wherever greed controls the heart, suffering follows. Then he showed me the second reason for Africa's collapse. And somehow, this one hurt even more. He said Africa was losing its young generation, not only physically, spiritually, mentally, morally. He showed me millions of young people growing up without guidance, without education, without discipline, without purpose. Some were destroyed by drugs, some by violence, some by hopelessness, and many were being trained to admire everything except themselves. He showed me young Africans who knew the history of foreign celebrities but nothing about their own ancestors. Young people who believed success meant escaping Africa instead of building it. Young people slowly becoming strangers to their own identity. Then Jesus said words that shook me deeply. He said, "The greatest attack against Africa is not against the land, it is against the mind of the youth." At that moment, I understood something I had never fully understood before. If you destroy the confidence of a generation, you do not need chains to control them. They will chain themselves. If you convince young people they are worthless, they will abandon their own future willingly. And if a generation loses both truth and hope, no army in the world can save that nation. I remember asking him why this was happening, why Africa continued suffering despite its beauty and resources. And he answered me carefully. He said many powerful systems survive because Africa remains divided, dependent, and spiritually weak. He showed me people becoming addicted to distraction, always entertained, always divided, always angry at one another, never united long enough to change anything. Then he turned toward me fully, and suddenly, everything around us became silent. It felt as though time itself had stopped. He looked directly into my eyes, not as a president, not as a soldier, not as a politician, but as a man. And he said something I will never forget. He said, "You must help awaken the youth." My heart began racing, because I knew those words carried responsibility. I asked him, "Why me? There are wiser people than me, older people, more educated people, more experienced leaders. Why would such a burden fall onto my shoulders?" And his answer humbled me. He said, "Because those who have suffered with the people can still hear the cries of the people." I felt tears in my eyes, because he was right. I knew suffering. I knew fear. I knew what it meant to grow up watching your people struggle while the world ignored them. And perhaps that is why the vision hurt me so deeply. Jesus then told me this mission would not be easy. He said many would misunderstand me. Some would attack me. Some would mock me. Some would call me dangerous simply because I encouraged young Africans to believe in themselves. But he warned me never to answer hatred with hatred, never to poison the youth with revenge, because a generation built on anger alone eventually destroys itself. Instead, he said the youth of Africa must be awakened through truth, discipline, courage, education, and unity. Not violence, not blind rage, but awakening. Then he began showing me things one after another. Lessons, warnings, responsibilities. Each one felt heavy. Each one felt urgent. And the first lesson he gave me was about leadership itself. He said if I truly wanted to help the youth of Africa, I could not simply speak beautiful words. I would first need to become an example they could trust. Jesus looked at me with great seriousness. Then he said something that cut through me like a blade. Young people no longer believe speeches. For a moment, I remained silent, because deep inside, I knew he was right. Across the world, generations had grown tired of promises, tired of leaders who spoke about sacrifice while living in luxury, tired of hearing words about justice from people who secretly benefited from injustice. Young people had learned to listen less to what leaders said and pay more attention to how they lived. Jesus told me that if I truly wanted to awaken the youth of Africa, I could not begin with speeches. I had to begin with myself. He said, before people follow your words, they watch your life. Those words stayed inside me, because leadership is easy when cameras are watching. Anyone can sound honest in front of microphones. Anyone can pretend to care during elections. But true character appears when nobody is looking. Jesus showed me images of leaders from many nations. Some wore expensive suits while their people starved. Some surrounded themselves with wealth while schools collapsed around them. Some spoke constantly about patriotism but secretly sold the future of their children for power. Then he said, a nation suffers when leadership becomes performance instead of service. I understood immediately. Too many leaders had become actors. They learned how to speak, how to smile, how to create images, but they forgot how to sacrifice. And young people could feel that dishonesty. Even when they said nothing, they felt it. Jesus told me the youth are not searching for perfection. They are searching for sincerity. They want proof that integrity still exists. They want to know whether someone in power can still live with discipline and humility. Then he asked me a question I never expected. He asked, how can you ask young people to reject greed if greed controls your own life? I lowered my head, because leadership begins with personal example. A corrupt leader creates a corrupt culture. A selfish leader creates selfish followers. A dishonest leader teaches a nation to lie. And eventually, the youth begin believing morality no longer matters. Jesus told me that many young Africans had stopped trusting leadership because they grew up watching hypocrisy. They saw leaders steal while preaching honesty. They saw powerful men escape consequences while ordinary citizens suffered punishment. They saw people rewarded not for character but for connections and manipulation. And over time, many young people began asking themselves a dangerous question. Why should I be honest in a dishonest world? That question destroys nations slowly. Because once integrity disappears, society begins collapsing from inside. Jesus said something else I will never forget. He said, the future of Africa will not only depend on strong institutions, it will depend on visible examples. Visible examples. Those words carried enormous meaning. Young people must see discipline lived out in reality. They must see leaders willing to sacrifice comfort. They must see courage that is not purchased by money. They must see people who choose service over personal gain. Because inspiration cannot survive on empty slogans. I remember telling him how difficult leadership can become, how pressure surrounds every decision, how enemies appear both inside and outside the nation, how corruption sometimes hides itself behind friendship, diplomacy, and opportunity. Jesus listened quietly. Then he said, the more power a man receives, the more temptation follows him. That truth frightened me. Because many leaders do not become corrupt in one moment. It happens slowly. A compromise here. A silence there. One betrayal justified as necessary. And eventually they no longer recognize themselves. Jesus warned me that if I wanted to help young Africans remain strong, I must first protect my own spirit from pride and greed. Because pride blinds leaders. It makes them believe they are above criticism, above truth, above accountability. And when leaders stop listening to truth, disaster follows. Then he showed me another vision. I saw a young boy watching a leader speak on television. The boy listened carefully, not because the speech was perfect, but because he believed the man speaking truly cared about his people. And in that moment, I understood something powerful. Young people are always watching, even when adults think they are distracted. They are watching how leaders behave during hardship. They are watching whether powerful people remain humble. They are watching whether honesty still exists in public life. And from those observations, they decide what kind of future is possible. Jesus then spoke to me about sacrifice. He said true leadership always costs something. Sometimes comfort, sometimes popularity, sometimes safety. He warned me that anyone who tries to protect both truth and personal comfort at the same time will eventually lose one of them. That statement stayed inside me like fire, because the world today often celebrates leaders who protect themselves first. Leaders who calculate every decision based on political survival. But history remembers something different. History remembers courage. History remembers sacrifice. History remembers the rare individuals willing to stand firm even when standing firm became dangerous. Jesus told me Africa desperately needed leaders who could remind young people that dignity still matters more than wealth. That service still matters more than status. That discipline still matters more than image. Then he looked at me and said, "Do not ask the youth to become what you refuse to become yourself." I felt the full weight of those words, because many people want to guide the next generation without first correcting themselves. But young people notice contradictions quickly. If leaders preach unity while spreading division, the youth see it. If leaders preach honesty while stealing, the youth see it. If leaders speak about hope while acting without integrity, the youth see it. And eventually cynicism spreads everywhere. Jesus warned me that hopelessness among the youth does not appear overnight. It grows slowly through disappointment, broken promises, repeated betrayal, corruption becoming normal, until finally, young people stop expecting goodness from anyone. That is when nations become spiritually exhausted. But he also showed me something beautiful. He showed me what happens when even one honest example appears. I saw young people beginning to believe again, not because someone promised miracles, but because they finally saw proof that leadership with integrity was still possible. And Jesus said, one honest example can awaken millions more effectively than 1,000 speeches. At that moment, I realized this mission was larger than politics. It was about rebuilding trust, rebuilding dignity, rebuilding belief, especially among the youth. Because if the young generation loses faith completely, the future collapses before it even arrives. Then Jesus turned away slightly and looked across the dark future surrounding us. And he told me the next lesson. He said if Africa was going to survive, young people would first need to rediscover their own value. Jesus walked slowly across the dry ground while I followed behind him. The darkness around us still remained, but now I could see it more clearly. Not only poverty, not only violence, but something deeper hiding inside the hearts of people. A wound of inferiority. A silent belief that Africa was somehow less valuable than the rest of the world. Jesus stopped walking and looked toward a group of young people standing together in the distance. At first they seemed alive physically, but their spirits looked tired, defeated, as though someone had convinced them long ago that greatness belonged only to others. Then he said to me, "Many young Africans no longer know their worth." Those words hurt because I had seen that pain in real life many times before. I had seen brilliant young minds apologize for their own identity. I had seen educated Africans speak proudly about foreign cultures while mocking their own traditions. I had seen young people measure beauty, intelligence, and success using standards created far away from their homeland. And slowly, many began believing they were born inferior. Jesus showed me how dangerous that mindset had become. Because once a people lose pride in who they are, they become vulnerable to manipulation. They stop protecting their culture. They stop defending their dignity. They stop believing they deserve control over their own future. And eventually they begin depending emotionally on the approval of others. Jesus said this destruction did not happen by accident. It was taught over generations, through media, through politics, through systems designed to make Africans admire outsiders more than themselves. He showed me classrooms where children learned more about distant empires than about the heroes of their own continent. He showed me young people consuming endless messages telling them that success only existed elsewhere. Then he asked me something painful. How can a generation build Africa if they secretly believe Africa has no value? I had no answer, because that question revealed the center of the crisis. Many young Africans had not only lost opportunities, they had lost confidence. And confidence is necessary for civilization itself. Without confidence, innovation dies, leadership dies, vision dies. A people who believe they are weak eventually behave as though weakness is their destiny. Jesus then showed me another vision. I saw a young African girl standing before a mirror. At first she smiled naturally, but then voices surrounded her. Voices from advertisements, movies, social media, foreign entertainment. And slowly her smile disappeared, because every voice around her told her she was not enough, not beautiful enough, not modern enough, not valuable enough. By the end of the vision, she no longer recognized her own worth. And I understood something terrifying. The battle for Africa was not only happening through economics or politics, it was happening inside the minds of the youth. Jesus told me many powerful systems survive because African people remain psychologically dependent. If young Africans believe greatness belongs somewhere else, they will continue exporting their talent while importing their self-worth from outside. Then he looked directly at me and said, "You must help them remember who they are." Those words carried enormous weight, because identity matters. A generation disconnected from its identity becomes spiritually homeless. Easy to influence, easy to divide, easy to control. Jesus told me helping the youth believe in themselves was not about teaching arrogance. It was about restoring dignity, teaching them that their skin was not a curse, teaching them that intelligence exists in every nation, teaching them that Africa's suffering does not mean Africans are inferior. He showed me the history of exploitation across the continent, resources taken, borders manipulated, conflicts encouraged, economies controlled. And yet, despite all this, Africa still survived. That alone proves strength. Then Jesus said something that stayed inside my soul. He said, "A people who survive centuries of exploitation are not weak, they are wounded. Wounded, not worthless, not cursed, wounded. There is a difference, and wounded people can heal." Jesus showed me young Africans who possessed incredible gifts. Scientists, teachers, engineers, farmers, artists, builders, leaders. But many of them never discovered their own potential because nobody taught them to believe in themselves. Some were destroyed by hopelessness before their gifts could mature. Others abandoned their countries because they believed success could never exist at home. And many became trapped between two identities, rejected by the world they admired, disconnected from the culture they came from. Jesus warned me that one of the greatest dangers facing young Africans was self-rejection. When people reject themselves, they begin imitating everything without wisdom. They lose discernment. They confuse imitation with progress. And eventually they forget what made them unique. Then he spoke words that felt especially important for older generations listening today. He said elders carry a responsibility to protect the dignity of the youth, not only by feeding them physically, but by feeding their sense of identity. Because children first learn how valuable they are from the voices around them. If a generation grows up hearing only criticism, shame, and hopelessness, insecurity becomes rooted deeply inside them. Jesus showed me parents exhausted by poverty speaking fear into their children without realizing it. Teachers who had themselves lost hope unintentionally passing despair forward. Communities so wounded that they no longer expected greatness from their own youth. And over time, low expectations became normal. But Jesus said something beautiful afterward. He said, "The moment a young person truly believes they have value, chains begin breaking." I saw it immediately in the vision. I saw young Africans standing taller, speaking with confidence, studying with purpose, creating businesses, building communities, protecting their nations, not because someone rescued them, but because they rediscovered belief in themselves. And suddenly I understood why so many systems work hard to keep young people distracted and divided. Because an awakened generation becomes difficult to manipulate. Young people who know their value ask questions. They challenge corruption. They reject humiliation. They stop begging for dignity because they already understand they deserve it. Jesus told me Africa's future would depend heavily on whether the next generation could recover self-respect before hopelessness consumed them completely. Then he warned me of another danger. He said confidence without knowledge becomes recklessness, and knowledge without morality becomes dangerous. That was when the vision around us changed again. I began seeing millions of children. Children without schools, children without books, children without guidance. And Jesus turned toward me with sadness in his eyes. He said, "A nation that abandons education abandons its own future." The ground beneath us began to change. The dry earth slowly became roads filled with children, thousands of them, then millions. Some carried torn notebooks. Some walked long distances barefoot. Some sat beneath trees trying to study without teachers, without electricity, without proper classrooms. And many had nothing at all. No school, no books, no chance. Jesus looked at them silently for a long moment. Then he said, "Every child ignored today becomes a crisis tomorrow." Those words entered my heart deeply, Because education is not simply about reading and writing. Education determines whether a generation becomes free or dependent, whether they become builders or victims, whether they shape the future or become controlled by it. Jesus showed me villages where children desperately wanted to learn but could not. I saw boys leaving school to work in mines. I saw girls abandoning education because poverty forced them into survival too early. I saw classrooms with broken walls and exhausted teachers trying to carry impossible burdens. And then I saw something even more painful. I saw brilliant minds slowly disappearing because nobody invested in them. Potential wasted, dreams buried before they could grow. Jesus said, "The world fears educated youth who can think independently." At first, that statement surprised me. But then he showed me why. An educated generation begins asking difficult questions. Why are we poor while our land is rich? Why do outsiders benefit more from our resources than our own people? Why do corruption and dependency continue generation after generation? Why are we taught to consume more than we create? Questions threaten systems built on manipulation. That is why ignorance becomes useful to those who profit from weakness. Jesus showed me leaders who intentionally neglected education because uninformed populations are easier to control. People struggling only to survive rarely have time to challenge injustice. And when education collapses, truth becomes fragile. Rumors spread easily. Propaganda spreads easily. Fear spreads easily. A nation without education becomes vulnerable from every direction. Then Jesus turned toward me and asked, "How can Africa protect its future if its children are not prepared to lead it?" I could feel the weight of that question immediately, because the future will not be built by speeches alone. It will be built by minds, by engineers, doctors, scientists, teachers, farmers with modern knowledge, young innovators capable of solving African problems using African intelligence. Jesus showed me another vision. I saw foreign experts arriving to manage resources inside African nations while local youth remained unemployed. Not because Africans lacked intelligence, but because too many were denied proper preparation. And I understood the humiliation hidden inside dependency. A continent rich in talent forced to depend endlessly on outside expertise because education was neglected for too long. Jesus said, "A people who cannot educate their children eventually surrender control of their destiny." Those words struck me with enormous force. Because education is power, real power, more powerful than weapons, more powerful than money. An educated generation cannot easily be deceived, cannot easily be manipulated, cannot easily be enslaved mentally. Jesus then showed me schools transformed. I saw classrooms filled with energy, young girls studying science confidently, young boys learning technology instead of violence, teachers respected again, communities protecting education as if it were sacred, and I saw hope returning through knowledge, not false hope, real hope, the kind that grows when people gain skills capable of changing their lives. Jesus told me Africa must stop treating education as a luxury. It must become a national mission, not only for governments, for parents, communities, religious leaders, everyone. Because every child denied education weakens the future of the continent itself. Then he spoke about something important that many people ignore. He said education without morality creates intelligent destroyers. That sentence stayed inside me, because knowledge alone does not guarantee wisdom. A person can become highly educated yet still corrupt, still selfish, still destructive. Jesus showed me educated individuals using their intelligence to steal from their own people, manipulating systems, exploiting the weak, serving greed instead of humanity. And he warned me that Africa did not simply need educated youth. Africa needed principled youth, young people with both knowledge and conscience, skill and integrity, strength and compassion. Then he showed me the danger of copying educational systems blindly without understanding African realities. I saw students memorizing information disconnected from their communities, disconnected from agriculture, disconnected from local innovation, disconnected from solving the actual problems surrounding them, and many graduated holding certificates but lacking purpose. Jesus said true education should prepare people not only to seek jobs, but to build societies, to solve problems, to create opportunities, to strengthen their nations. Then he looked at me carefully and said, "Teach the youth to create, not only to consume." That message felt urgent, because too many young people across the world are being trained only to consume entertainment, trends, and products created elsewhere. But a generation that only consumes eventually becomes dependent. Africa needs creators, builders, inventors, thinkers, people willing to shape the future instead of merely watching it happen. Jesus showed me young Africans developing technologies for farming, water systems, medicine, and communication. I saw villages transformed through local innovation. I saw universities becoming centers of progress instead of symbols of frustration. And I saw pride returning to communities when young people realized they could contribute meaningfully to their nations. Then the vision darkened again. I saw children sitting alone with phones glowing in their faces, not learning, not growing, only distracted endlessly. Hours disappearing, attention disappearing, discipline disappearing. Jesus warned me that modern distractions were becoming another form of control, because distracted youth lose focus, and a generation without focus becomes vulnerable. He said many forces profit from keeping young people entertained but intellectually weak, always scrolling, always reacting, never reflecting deeply, never building patiently, never developing the discipline required for transformation. Then he spoke words every parent and grandparent listening today should hear. He said, "Protect the minds of children as carefully as you protect their bodies, because what enters the mind eventually shapes destiny." Violence, corruption, materialism, hopelessness. These things spread through culture long before they appear in behavior. Jesus showed me families losing connection with each other, children learning values from screens more than from elders, communities forgetting wisdom passed down through generations, and slowly, moral confusion growing everywhere. But then I saw another image. I saw teachers mentoring students with care, parents encouraging discipline and purpose, communities celebrating knowledge instead of mocking it, and little by little the future began changing. Because education guided by wisdom creates stability, it creates self-respect, it creates independence. Jesus turned toward me again, and I could see sorrow in his eyes, because he knew another danger was destroying countless young people before their potential could ever fully emerge. A danger spreading through addiction, corruption, violence, and despair. Then he said quietly, "Now you must see what is trapping the souls of the youth." The vision around us changed once again. The schools disappeared. The roads faded into darkness. And suddenly I found myself standing in the middle of a crowded city at night. Music blasted from distant buildings. Lights flashed everywhere. Cars moved through the streets. People laughed loudly. At first glance, it looked alive, modern, exciting. But the longer I looked, the more emptiness I saw hidden beneath it all. Jesus stood beside me silently. Then he pointed toward groups of young people gathered on street corners. Some looked angry. Some looked lost. Some looked numb, as if they no longer felt anything inside themselves. Many were searching desperately for escape. Escape from poverty. Escape from pain. Escape from hopelessness. And because they could not find healing, they accepted destruction instead. Jesus said softly, "A wounded generation will search for relief anywhere." Then I began seeing the traps one after another. Drugs spreading through neighborhoods. Violence becoming normal. Corruption treated like survival. Young people chasing fast money because they no longer believed patience would ever reward them. I saw boys becoming criminals before becoming men. I saw girls losing dignity because society convinced them their worth depended on attention and material things. I saw social media turning insecurity into addiction. And everywhere I looked, there was one thing missing. Direction. Purpose. Guidance. Jesus showed me how hopelessness creates vulnerability. When young people believe their future is already destroyed, they stop protecting themselves. They stop protecting their communities. And eventually many begin destroying each other. Then he looked directly at me and said, "The enemy does not always arrive carrying weapons." That sentence stayed with me, because many of the forces destroying the youth today do not look dangerous at first. Some appear glamorous. Some appear entertaining. Some appear profitable. But slowly, they drain discipline, morality, and self-control from entire generations. Jesus showed me young people becoming addicted not only to substances but to distraction itself, always seeking pleasure, always seeking escape, never learning endurance, never developing patience, and without discipline, even intelligent people become easy to control. Then I saw something painful. I saw corruption spreading among the youth long before they entered leadership. Young people learning early that dishonesty was the easiest path, cheating becoming normal, lying becoming normal, betrayal becoming normal, and over time, integrity began looking foolish to them. Jesus said, "When corruption becomes culture, nations begin collapsing from within." That truth frightened me deeply, Because corruption is not only about stolen money, it is about the destruction of trust. Once trust disappears, society becomes unstable. People stop believing in institutions, stop believing in justice, stop believing in each other, and eventually survival becomes more important than morality. Jesus then showed me how violence spreads through wounded communities. I saw young men carrying rage inherited from generations before them, fatherless boys searching for identity inside gangs, children growing up surrounded by humiliation and instability until aggression became their language. Then he said something powerful. He said, "A young person without guidance will often follow whoever offers belonging first." That is why dangerous groups target the youth. Because lonely people are easy to recruit. Hopeless people are easy to manipulate. A young man who feels invisible becomes vulnerable to anyone who promises him power, recognition, or purpose. Jesus showed me extremists using anger to capture broken minds, drug dealers profiting from despair, corrupt politicians using division to control frustrated populations. And behind all of it, I could see something larger. A system benefiting from confusion, because distracted and divided youth rarely unite to challenge injustice. Then Jesus turned toward me and said something every society must understand. He said, "You cannot save the youth only by punishing them after they fall. You must protect them before they fall." That statement carried wisdom, because many young people destroying themselves today were first abandoned emotionally, spiritually, or socially long before their behavior collapsed. Some lacked mentors, some lacked opportunity, some lacked stable families, some lacked anyone who truly believed in them. And eventually the streets became their teachers instead. Jesus showed me boys who once dreamed of becoming doctors or engineers, slowly transformed by hopeless environments, not because they were born evil, but because despair reshaped them. That realization broke my heart, because every destroyed young life represents stolen potential, potential that could have strengthened families, communities, and nations. Then Jesus showed me another danger spreading quietly. He showed me a culture teaching young people to mock responsibility, mock discipline, mock commitment. Everything serious became boring. Everything destructive became freedom. And slowly, self-destruction began disguising itself as modern progress. Jesus warned me that societies collapse when they glorify chaos while ridiculing virtue. When young people stop respecting honesty, hard work, and self-control, decline accelerates rapidly. He showed me communities where elders were ignored, families fractured, children raised without moral direction. And into that emptiness entered addiction, materialism, and violence. Then he asked me a painful question. What happens to a continent when its strongest generation loses its moral compass? I looked around at the vision surrounding us, and I saw the answer clearly. Confusion, division, fear, manipulation. Nations become weak when their youth becomes spiritually exhausted. Jesus then spoke about the importance of teaching discernment. He said young people must learn to distinguish between freedom and self-destruction, because not everything that feels good leads to life, and not everything difficult is harmful. Discipline is difficult. Education is difficult. Responsibility is difficult. But those things build strength. Meanwhile, addiction feels easy at first. Corruption feels profitable at first. Violence feels powerful at first. But eventually they destroy both individuals and nations. Then Jesus showed me a different vision. I saw young people rejecting those traps. I saw communities mentoring their youth instead of abandoning them. I saw former addicts helping others recover. I saw young men protecting neighborhoods instead of terrorizing them. I saw young women rediscovering dignity and confidence. And I saw purpose returning where hopelessness once lived. Jesus said something beautiful then. He said, "Young people do not become strong because they never face darkness. They become strong when they learn they are greater than it." That message filled me with hope, because Africa's youth are not weak. They are under attack, spiritually, mentally, economically, emotionally, and yet many still continue fighting to survive with dignity. Jesus told me the answer was not hatred toward the youth, not condemnation, but awakening, guidance, truth, opportunity. Communities must stop treating young people as disposable, because the future itself lives inside them. Then the vision around us began shifting again. The city disappeared slowly, and I suddenly saw maps of Africa spreading across the horizon, borders, flex, nation. But instead of unity, I saw conflict everywhere. And Jesus looked at me with deep sadness, because the next lesson he wanted me to understand was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Division. The vision expanded until the entire continent of Africa stood before my eyes. I could see deserts, forests, villages, cities, rivers moving through the land like veins carrying life. The beauty of Africa was still there, but something painful divided it. Lines, borders, conflicts, distrust. Jesus stood beside me looking across the continent in silence. Then he said, "A divided people become easy to control." I felt those words immediately, because throughout history, division has always weakened nations more effectively than direct attack. If people hate each other enough, outsiders no longer need to destroy them. They destroy themselves. Jesus showed me scenes from across Africa. Nations arguing while foreign interests quietly benefited. Leaders refusing cooperation because of pride in politics. Communities divided by tribe, language, religion, and historical wounds. And while Africans fought among themselves, others continued extracting wealth from the continent. Then Jesus asked me a question. How can a house stand if every room is at war with the others? I had no answer, because the truth was visible everywhere around me. Africa possessed immense strength, immense resources, immense human potential, but division kept turning that strength against itself. Jesus showed me how deeply tribal hatred had wounded generations. I saw children inheriting resentment before they even understood history. Communities teaching fear of one another instead of understanding. Politicians manipulating ethnic tensions to gain power. And every time division intensified, ordinary people suffered most. He said something then that stayed inside my spirit. He said, "Many conflicts survive because someone profits from keeping brothers separated." That truth explained much of what I had witnessed throughout my life. Division creates weakness. Weakness creates dependency. Dependency creates control. And so long as Africans remain fragmented emotionally and politically, others would continue shaping the future of the continent for their own benefit. Jesus showed me another vision. I saw African leaders standing together with dignity instead of suspicion. I saw nations cooperating in agriculture, education, technology, and security. I saw resources benefiting local populations instead of disappearing outward endlessly. And for the first time since entering that strange future, I saw a glimpse of real strength emerging. Then Jesus turned toward me and said, "Unity does not mean sameness." That sentence carried wisdom, because Africa is diverse. Different cultures, different languages, different traditions, and that diversity itself is beautiful. The problem is not difference. The problem is hatred. The problem is manipulation. The problem is teaching people to fear one another instead of recognizing shared humanity. Jesus said powerful people often use division because united populations become difficult to dominate. If tribes fight tribes, they remain distracted. If religions fight religions, they remain distracted. If neighboring nations distrust one another, cooperation becomes impossible. And meanwhile, exploitation continues quietly. Then he showed me something painful. I saw young Africans insulting one another online constantly, mocking each other's countries, mocking each other's accents, mocking each other's cultures, and slowly, even the digital world became another battlefield of division. Jesus shook his head sadly, because he knew division weakens the spirit long before it weakens institutions. He said, "A generation taught to hate one another will never build together." That truth felt especially urgent, because the future belongs to cooperation. No African nation can fully rise alone while surrounded by instability and manipulation. The challenges facing the continent are too large for isolation. Poverty, education, security, technology, infrastructure. These require unity of vision, unity of purpose. Jesus then showed me elders from different communities sitting together peacefully, sharing wisdom, solving problems, protecting future generations together. And I realized something important. Division is not inevitable. It is taught, which means unity can also be taught. Children are not born hating tribes. They are not born hating neighboring nations. They learn it from wounded adults, political manipulation, and inherited fear. Jesus said healing Africa would require courageous people willing to reject inherited hatred. People strong enough to choose dialogue over revenge, wisdom over pride, cooperation over ego. Then he looked at me carefully and asked, "What is stronger, the pain of the past or the hope of the future?" That question remained inside me, because many societies become trapped inside old wounds. And while remembering history matters, living permanently inside bitterness destroys progress. Jesus did not tell me to ignore injustice. He did not tell me to accept exploitation silently, but he warned me that hatred itself eventually poisons those who carry it. A future built entirely on revenge can never become peaceful. Then he showed me young Africans from different nations working together, building businesses, sharing knowledge, creating technologies, protecting communities. And suddenly the borders I had seen earlier no longer looked like walls. They looked like bridges. I realized then that Africa's greatest strength may not be its resources. It may be its people once they rediscover common purpose. Jesus said something powerful afterward. He said, "The world fears a united Africa because unity would awaken unimaginable strength." I understood exactly what he meant. A continent filled with young energy, natural wealth, creativity, resilience, and spiritual depth would become unstoppable if truly united by vision instead of divided by manipulation. But he also warned me that unity requires maturity, discipline, humility, patience. Because selfish ambition destroys cooperation quickly, he showed me leaders refusing collaboration simply because they feared losing personal power. An entire population suffering because ego became more important than collective progress. Then Jesus spoke directly about the youth again. He said young Africans must reject inherited division before they can build a different future. They must learn to see one another as partners instead of enemies. They must stop allowing politicians, media, and outside interests to turn them against each other. Because every time Africans fight each other blindly, the continent becomes weaker. Then he looked across the continent once more. And slowly, the darkness around Africa began shifting. For the first time, I saw light spreading across certain regions. Not because miracles fell from the sky, but because people themselves were changing. Young people studying, communities rebuilding, nations cooperating, families healing. And then Jesus turned back toward me one final time. The expression in his eyes became very serious, because there was one last message he needed me to carry back with me. One final truth more dangerous than poverty itself. He looked directly into my soul and said, "The greatest danger is not suffering. The greatest danger is when the youth lose hope completely." When Jesus spoke those words, everything around us became silent again. The wind stopped moving. The noise of conflict disappeared. Even the darkness seemed to pause. And then I saw them, millions of young faces across Africa, some standing in crowded cities, some deep inside villages, some in refugee camps, some walking endless roads searching for opportunity. Different languages, different nations, different stories, but many carried the same expression in their eyes: exhaustion. Jesus looked at them with deep sadness. Then he said, "When young people lose hope, nations begin dying from the inside." I felt those words deeply because hope is not a small thing. Hope is what gives people the strength to continue suffering without surrendering. It is what allows a mother to keep sacrificing for her children. It is what allows a student to continue studying despite poverty. It is what allows a generation to believe tomorrow can become better than today. Without hope, people stop building, stop dreaming, stop resisting destruction. Jesus showed me young Africans waking up every morning without purpose. Some no longer believed education mattered. Some no longer believed honesty mattered. Some no longer believed hard work would ever change their lives. And when hopelessness spreads widely enough, entire societies begin collapsing spiritually. Then he showed me something terrifying. I saw hopeless youth becoming easy targets for every destructive force imaginable. Violence recruited them. Addiction consumed them. Corruption purchased them. Extremism manipulated them. Because hopeless people often stop protecting their future. Why protect tomorrow if you no longer believe tomorrow exists? Jesus then asked me, what happens when an entire generation stops believing life has meaning? I looked around at the broken future surrounding us, and I already knew the answer. Chaos, division, self-destruction. A society where survival becomes the only goal eventually loses its soul. Then Jesus showed me another vision. I saw a young boy sitting alone beside a broken wall. His clothes were torn. His stomach was empty. But inside his eyes there was still determination. He still believed life could become something more. And Jesus pointed toward him and said, as long as hope survives, the future can still be rebuilt. That statement filled me with emotion. Because hope does not require perfect conditions. Some of the strongest people on earth continue hoping despite terrible suffering. Africa itself is proof of that. Despite centuries of exploitation, war, poverty, and manipulation, millions still wake up every day fighting for dignity. Still working, still praying, still loving their families, still believing change remains possible. Jesus told me this surviving hope was one of Africa's greatest treasures, and that many forces were trying desperately to extinguish it, not always through violence, sometimes through humiliation, through endless negative messaging, through convincing young Africans that failure was their destiny, because hopeless people are easier to control than hopeful people. Hope creates resistance. Hope creates courage. Hope creates vision. Then Jesus showed me something beautiful. I saw classrooms filled with students eager to learn. I saw young farmers transforming communities. I saw African scientists creating solutions. I saw musicians and artists restoring pride to their cultures. I saw young leaders rejecting corruption. And slowly, light began spreading across the continent. Not all at once, but person by person, community by community, generation by generation. Jesus said, "The future of Africa will not be saved by magic. It will be saved by awakened youth." Those words became alive inside me. Awakened youth. Young people who understand their value. Young people willing to learn, willing to sacrifice, willing to reject corruption, willing to protect dignity instead of selling it. Jesus showed me millions of ordinary young Africans becoming extraordinary simply because they stopped believing the lies spoken over them. Lies that said they were inferior. Lies that said Africa had no future. Lies that said they existed only to serve the interests of others. And as those lies disappeared, strength returned. Then he said something every older generation listening today must understand. He said the youth do not only need criticism, they need guidance, encouragement, examples worth following. Many young people are not evil. They are lost. And lost people require direction more than condemnation. Jesus showed me elders mentoring children patiently, communities protecting young minds from destruction, teachers rebuilding confidence, parents speaking life into their children despite hardship. And through those acts, hope survived. Then I realized something important. Hope is contagious. One hopeful person can influence many others. One disciplined young leader can inspire an entire neighborhood. One honest teacher can transform generations. One courageous example can awaken people who had almost surrendered completely. Jesus then turned toward me again, and his expression became both serious and compassionate. He said, "You must tell them they are not forgotten." At that moment, I understood why I had been shown everything, not to spread fear, not to create hatred, but to awaken responsibility, especially among the youth. Because the future of Africa will not ultimately be decided by foreign governments, or by television networks, or by corporations. It will be decided by the minds, character, and courage of the next generation. Jesus warned me that time mattered. Every year, more young people were being consumed by hopelessness. Every year, more children were growing up without proper direction. Every year, more talent was being lost. And yet, he also reminded me that history can change quickly once people awaken. He showed me moments from history where entire nations transformed because ordinary people finally believed change was possible. Then he spoke one final truth before everything began fading. He said, "Never underestimate what a generation can become once it rediscovers faith in itself." Those words entered my spirit like fire, because I finally understood Africa's greatest resource is not gold, not oil, not diamonds. It is its people, especially its youth. If properly guided, educated, united, and awakened, no force on earth could permanently keep Africa beneath its potential. Then the light around Jesus began growing brighter. The vision started disappearing slowly. The broken cities faded. The cries faded. The darkness faded. And before he disappeared completely, he looked at me one final time. There was both warning and hope in his eyes. Then he said quietly, "Now go back. Speak the truth. Do not remain silent." And suddenly, I woke up. My heart was beating heavily. The room was dark except for the first light of morning entering through the window. For several moments, I could not move. Everything felt real, too real. The suffering, the warnings, the responsibility. I sat there in silence, listening to my own breathing. And deep inside myself, I knew something had changed forever. I understood that my life no longer belonged only to me. I could no longer stay silent while generations were losing hope. I could no longer pretend the crisis facing African youth was only economic or political. It was spiritual, mental, moral, civilizational. That morning I made a decision. I would continue speaking for the dignity of Africa. I would continue fighting for the youth, not because I believed I was perfect, but because silence had become impossible. I understood clearly now that if Africa's young people receive education, guidance, opportunity, discipline, and belief, then no force on earth will permanently stop Africa from rising. And today, as I speak these words to you, I ask every person listening to reflect deeply, especially the older generation. What kind of future are we leaving behind? What values are we teaching the youth? What examples are we showing them? Because history is not only written by presidents, it is written inside homes, inside schools, inside communities, inside the hearts of young people deciding whether to surrender or continue fighting for a better future. And if even one young person listening to my voice tonight begins believing in their worth again, if even one young person rejects corruption, hatred, addiction, or hopelessness after hearing this message, then perhaps the future I saw does not have to become reality. Perhaps history has not abandoned us yet. And perhaps Africa's greatest chapter has not been written in the past, but is still waiting in the future. For many days after that dream, I could not speak about it openly. I carried it silently inside my heart. Everywhere I traveled, the images returned to me. The children without schools. The young people consumed by hopelessness. The warnings Jesus showed me about division, corruption, and the destruction of identity. At times, I wondered whether people would understand, or whether they would dismiss everything as imagination. But the more I watched the world around me, the more I realized the message was already unfolding before our eyes. Not only in Africa, across the world. I saw societies becoming richer materially while becoming weaker spiritually. I saw technology connecting people while loneliness continued growing. I saw young people surrounded by information yet starving for wisdom. And I understood something clearly. Humanity has advanced in many ways. But advancement without morality creates dangerous civilizations. That is why today I speak not only to Africans, but to all people willing to listen. Especially parents, grandparents, teachers, leaders, because the battle for the next generation is happening now. Every day, young minds are being shaped by what they see, hear, celebrate, and imitate. Some are learning discipline, others are learning chaos, some are learning truth, others are learning manipulation, and the consequences will define the future. When I think about the youth of Africa, I do not see weakness. I see potential buried beneath suffering. I see intelligence waiting for opportunity. I see courage waiting for guidance. I see millions of young people who only need someone to remind them they were not born to live without dignity. That is why I refuse to accept the idea that Africa is doomed. No, Africa is wounded, but wounded things can heal. I have seen too much resilience to believe otherwise. I have seen children studying under impossible conditions and still succeeding. I have seen mothers carrying entire families through sacrifice. I have seen communities rebuilding themselves after destruction. That strength is real. But strength without direction can still be lost. That is why awakening matters. Not awakening through hatred, not awakening through revenge, but awakening through truth, discipline, education, and unity. I do not want young Africans to hate the rest of the world. Hatred only creates new chains. I want them to respect themselves enough to stop surrendering their future. I want them to understand that dignity cannot be imported. It must be protected from within. And I say this especially to older people listening today. Do not underestimate your influence. A single conversation can save a young life. A single example of integrity can shape a child's future forever. Many young people are searching desperately for someone authentic to follow. Someone who still believes character matters. Someone who still believes sacrifice matters. Someone who still believes goodness is possible in a world filled with confusion. Be that example whenever you can. Because civilization survives through moral inheritance. Each generation passes something to the next. Either wisdom or destruction. Either courage or fear. Either dignity or surrender. And today, too many young people are inheriting confusion. We must change that. I also want to speak directly to young people hearing my voice right now. Do not allow this world to convince you that your life has no value. Do not let social media define your identity. Do not trade your dignity for temporary approval. Do not believe the lie that corruption is the only path to survival. And never believe your skin, your background, or your nation makes you inferior to anyone else. You were born with purpose. You were born with the ability to build, create, and transform the world around you. But you must protect your mind carefully. Because many forces benefit from your distraction, your confusion, your hopelessness. Protect your attention. Protect your discipline. Protect your moral compass. Because once those things disappear, manipulation becomes easy. And to the leaders of nations, including myself, we must also face responsibility honestly. Young people become angry when they repeatedly witness hypocrisy. We cannot preach sacrifice while living selfishly. We cannot speak about patriotism while selling the future of our people. We cannot demand integrity from youth while practicing corruption ourselves. Leadership must become service again. Otherwise, future generations will stop believing in leadership altogether. That would be dangerous for every society. Sometimes people ask me why I speak so much about youth. The answer is simple. Because whoever shapes the youth shapes the future. If the youth become disciplined, educated, and united, nations become stronger. If the youth become hopeless, divided, and addicted to destruction, collapse follows eventually, no matter how rich a country appears externally. And that is why this battle matters so much. Not only for Africa, for humanity. The world today does not simply need smarter people. It needs wiser people. People capable of using knowledge with conscience. People who still understand compassion, truth, and responsibility. Without those things, progress becomes dangerous. I think often about the final words Jesus spoke to me in that vision. Do not remain silent. Those words still follow me. And perhaps that is why I continue speaking even when criticism comes. Because silence in the face of destruction eventually becomes another form of surrender. No generation is perfect. Mine is not perfect. The next one will not be perfect either. But every generation receives a choice to continue cycles of corruption and hopelessness, or to interrupt them. I still believe interruption is possible. I still believe awakening is possible. I still believe Africa can rise not through imitation, but through rediscovering its own strength. And I still believe the youth will decide much of that future. So tonight, wherever you are listening from, I ask you to remember this. No child is born hating themselves. No people are born destined for humiliation. No nation is permanently condemned to suffering. Human beings create systems, and human beings can also change them. That change begins first inside the mind, inside the spirit, inside the decision to reject hopelessness. I pray that better days will come to Africa. I pray that better days will come to the world. I pray that young people everywhere will rediscover discipline, dignity, wisdom, and faith in themselves. I pray that leaders will choose service over greed. I pray families will become strong again. I pray communities will heal division before hatred consumes future generations completely. And I pray humanity remembers that progress without morality eventually destroys itself. If these words touched your heart tonight, then hold on to them. Share them with someone who may have forgotten their worth. Speak hope into a young person's life. Encourage them to learn. Encourage them to build. Encourage them to believe they can become more than the world expects from them. Because hopelessness spreads quickly. But hope can spread even faster when courageous people refuse to stay silent. And if you believe conversations like this still matter, then continue supporting voices that encourage truth, discipline, faith, and awakening. Not for fame, not for politics, but because the future belongs to the generations being shaped right now. I speak these words not as a perfect man, not as someone above others, but as someone who has seen enough suffering to know silence is dangerous, and as someone who still believes humanity can choose a better path. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from the deepest truth inside my soul. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and before God, I tell you these things honestly. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and everything I have spoken tonight, I have spoken with conviction, faith, and truth.